All right, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. I assume a few folks may join as we get going here, but I want to make sure we have plenty of time for our panelists to speak this afternoon. It's just afternoon in Denver time. I guess it's still morning on the West Coast. So thanks everybody for joining the Optimizing Transmission Networks to Enhance Grid Resiliency and Meet Climate Goals panel. And we're really happy today to have these three panelists join us. I want to remind you that their bios are on the main event website or page, main event page. So I encourage you to go look at that if you want to know more about the details of their background. I'm just going to briefly introduce them. First, we have Tracy from I'm sorry, I almost got it mixed up. From ACORE. Thanks, Tracy, for joining us. And Tracy leads the new, fairly recently launched macro grid initiative, which she's going to talk to us a little bit more about. And then Jay is going to join us. He's from Grid Strategies, a consulting company that focuses on understanding transmission and all the issues that surround it. And then Katie has joined us from EPRI, and Katie comes from DOE originally and then to EPRI not too long ago, Katie. And Katie's one of the most recent members of a GridWise Alliance board. So we're happy to welcome her on board in that capacity as well. So I'm going to take you guys in that order. You'll each have kind of up to 10 minutes to talk through some of your slides or the comments that you'd like to make. And then I've got some questions prepared. And for those of you in the audience, we encourage you to submit some questions online as we go. We'll be monitoring those, and I'll do my best to moderate those questions towards the end of the session. So Tracy, if you want to share your screen, I think we figured out how to do that. You're on.
Good afternoon, everybody. I am going to try to share my screen. Please let me know when you see. Do you see my screen?
We can see your screen.
Okay.
If you want to put it in show mode, it's not in show mode yet. There you go.
Okay. All right. I think you're also seeing what my next slide is. But anyway, as Steve said, thank you for that introduction. Thanks everybody for joining this session. As Steve said, I'm the director of the very newly launched Macro Grid Initiative. This is a partnership of ACORE, which is the American Council on Renewable Energy, and ASEG, which is Americans for a Clean Energy Grid, and we are funded by by Breakthrough Energy, which is a Bill Gates initiative. So, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what what our vision is. The other piece of my background is that I spent 13 years at the National NRECA, National Rural Electric Cooperative Association. So, which would explain why I have this first slide. As I look at what's before us, and in particular the challenge of grid modernization, I think that there are some lessons from rural electrification that are actually helpful in pointing out strategies that can help us meet these challenges. Once upon a time, we were able to build big things, and we were able to build a grid that spanned the North American continent, and many people believe that was the single most significant engineering feat of the 20th century. This picture, I love this picture. It's so typical of that era. But if you look at the sign and you read the sign closely, I think there are clues for what will help us. The first is partnership. So working together, we did it. Oh, in case you couldn't figure this out, this is right after electricity had come to a small town, this was the celebration. So you can see that it was a partnership, and that partnership was the REA working with the community. There's a focus on the consumer. That focus is right there in the third line of the sign where it says at lowest cost. So I think that's especially important. The community support, you can, especially when we're talking about transmission, increasingly getting that community and local buy-in is going to be important. Persistence is also important. And finally, the last line in the sign, it says a dream come true. Well, that's the vision. And that vision led to electricity coming to that town, but also if you aggregate it, spanning, as I said, spanning the North American continent. And I'm going to refer back to these principles because I think they're useful. The macro grid initiative is an effort to build the support for the high voltage interregional transmission that is going to be necessary to connect the areas where our rich renewable resources are with the population centers. It's not more complicated than that. So if you look at this NREL map, it shows that the 15 states between the Rocky Mountains and the Mississippi River account for 88% of the national wind technical potential and 56% of solar technical potential. But this is not where the population is. It's in fact that same region is only has 30% of expected 2050 electricity demand. So how are we going to get those resources to the areas where they're needed? And I know that Jay is going to talk more about the work that NREL did in looking at various scenarios. But the premise of the macro grid initiative is that through a macro grid, we can connect these centers of high renewable resources with high electric demand and which will at the same time enhance grid resiliency and dramatically reduce carbon emissions. As most of you probably know, FERC Order 1000 was intended to spur the development of interregional high voltage transmission that would accomplish some of this, and it's been 10 years and that has not happened. So so that is the challenge that we're looking at. So the question is, if you look at that first slide and the spanning of the North American continent, and you wonder, can we do it again? Can we reconfigure the grid in a way that allows us to take advantage of these resources, and also there's some other, take advantage of the just the changing energy landscape and the change in what we require from the grid. If you look at those goals and then you look at some of the barriers, I think it is a serious question. Can we do this? And I think the next question is, can we afford not to? As many of you know, we've been talking about infrastructure for a long time. It's like Infrastructure Week in Washington is an unfunny punchline to jokes. We look at what's happening right now, and Congress is having difficulty passing a stimulus bill, and a COVID relief bill in the middle of a pandemic. So, there are some institutional challenges. But we're going to have to do something. And this is a statistic from the American Society of Civil Engineers, their failure to act report, which I highly recommend. A 2015 DOE report found that 70% of transformers and transmission lines are 25 years or older. Now, perhaps some of you are not old enough to recognize this picture, but that means that the transmission grid is older than you are. That, I think that is the point. 60% of circuit breakers are 30 years old. And of course, this is a 2015 report, so it's 5 years have passed since this report. I think what we're seeing is that the infrastructure is aging. Utilities are looking and starting to make the upgrades, but it's not being done in the context of a plan that takes into account electrification, that takes into account the need for renewable resources, that it's not being done in a holistic fashion. And so that I think that is a big part of what we're looking at. This is an interactive map from NRDC, and I think it's not interactive on my slide, but if you go to if you go to this site, you can see it shows it's a very clear story of the congestion. 245 clean energy projects that had reached advanced stages of the generator interconnection process were withdrawn. And when you look at why they were withdrawn, it was the costs of that interconnection and upgrading the transmission. And I think when I look at this map, and they interviewed some of the developers, what this is a lost economic opportunity for these communities. If you have a project that you think is going to be coming to your locality and then it's withdrawn because of congestion, that means that's an economic impact on a local community. And I think when you add up 245 of those, that's significant. What we're doing, we're missing some real opportunities for local investment. And I think that in this context of a struggling economy and a recession that has in particular hit rural communities harder, this is a significant lost opportunity. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, this is, we need to take into account electrification, and perhaps Katie's going to speak to that. But as we figure out how we're going to make transmission investments, this has to be a part of that calculation. This Brattle report, which was done for wires, projected that 70 gigawatts to 200 gigawatts of additional new power generation will be necessary by 2030. And as you know, getting a transmission line built is 10 years. So that's, you would need to be starting now to meet the additional electrification related demand, assuming this, by the way, assumes a 75% share of renewable resources and a 25% share of natural gas-fired resources. And so those are some of the drivers, but at the same time, I think it's worth pointing out that the U.S. is behind in this effort. This is a map from a report that the Macrogrid Initiative recently released. It was a survey done, an international survey of macrogrids in other countries, and you see that other countries are looking at their own needs. They are also trying to get access to their own renewable resources, which is, for many of them, there's a significant energy security benefit in addition to a reliability and resilience benefit, and of course a cost benefit. China, of course, is way ahead of the United States in this, but Europe is also ahead. And I think both Germany and China have seen this not only as an opportunity to improve their own electric grids, but also as an opportunity to capture a share of a market in exporting these technologies. That is something that I think, you know, in previous times, the U.S. would be, that would be our industry. We would be exporting our technologies. But what we find is that again, we are behind in this area. These are the macro grids that China is building. Since 2020, China's proposed to build 14 new UHV lines. 7 of these are ultra high voltage DC lines and 7 are ultra high voltage AC lines. The total size of the investment is 26.8 billion in 2020. Among these lines, there has been significant progress for 3 of them. There's one Chinese line in particular that has set world records for its length and its capacity. Again, it's just interesting to see that we've been surpassed. Here's the chart that you can see the scale. So I think that, you know, again, that's also goes under the heading of missed opportunities and not pursuing a macro grid. Recently, the MGI and Americans for a Clean Energy Grid released a report from with research from Chris Clack and Michael Goggin, and I can when I get out of this slideshow, I can drop that link into the chat. But the way this study worked was they evaluated 4 scenarios with varying degrees of CO2 emission reductions and relative shares of wind deployment. So they used both a business as usual, or taking the recent trends in carbon reductions, but also comparing that to what would have to happen if we were to try to meet the Paris climate accords, and looked at the transmission investment that would flow in order to build either a high solar penetration or a high wind penetration to meet those reductions. So in a sense, the CO2 reductions are a forcing function, and they look at the benefits that would flow. And this is just in the Eastern Connect. And I'm going to start with this chart, which shows the capital investment that would go into this region through 2050, building a high amount of solar and building a high amount of wind in the right hand. It's again an important benefit. And I should say, I meant to say, I talked about the reasons why the sort of negative reasons for a macro grid, which is we need to deal with our aging infrastructure. We don't want to miss opportunities, but these are the benefits, and I just want to go over these quickly. These are the benefits that flow from a significant investment in transmission. One thing that's interesting and that came out of the Clack study is that regardless of whether or not there's a price on carbon, these investments you're going to have to be investing in transmission, but it is much more cost effective to do it with, again, that holistic framework, knowing what you want the grid to look like at the end. So the next, this I think is a very telling slide, which is the job creation, and notably, no matter which scenario, you are investing in transmission and you are seeing tremendous job growth. So more than 1 million net new jobs by 2030 and 6 million net new jobs by 2050 in the Eastern US alone. Again, these are also jobs in rural communities, which I think is, again, going to be important as we're looking ahead at the impacts of this recession.
Tracy, can you wrap it up here in a minute?
Yep.
Good. Thank you.
Sorry. I have no idea how. Okay, let me just. I will just go. This is one that I did want everybody to see, which is the impact on cost. So you make an investment in transmission, and what happens is that the cost for consumers goes down because you have access to low cost renewable energy. So again, and I can, in our discussion later, I can talk about some of the policy goals that would need to that are necessary for building a macro grid. But this is our vision statement, and we're building a coalition of supporters, and we have also been very active in talking to policymakers about this and building public support for high voltage, for a holistic approach, and for high voltage interregional transmission. So.
Great. Thanks, Tracy. We will come back to you with some questions, I'm sure. Jay, over to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Well, I'm going to pull up my slides and hopefully you'll be able to see them just fine. But thanks for the opportunity to be part of this panel. I'm Jay Caspary. I'm with Grid Strategies. Prior to joining Grid Strategies a couple months ago, I spent about 20 years at Southwest Power Pool, where we stood up the RTO and did a lot of outreach on wind development and transmission development to enable wind and other resources, as well as interregional planning and talking about what we want this future grid to look like. So I'm going to share some slides and just walk through them real quickly, talk about how transmission has been an enabler for wind historically, and we expect it to be a grid going forward. We'll talk briefly about congestion and what we might be able to do in the interim to deal with congestion by using some grid enhancing technologies. I'll spend a little bit of time on the interconnection seam study and share an animation that'll give you an idea of what a macro grid could do to help us serve 2038 peak demand of the U.S. For the eastern and the western grids, at least. I think you'll find that of interest. Talk about some energy systems integration workshops and recommendations that are in the process of being finalized as we speak to deal with how do we move this forward and what do we want to get out of this effort to do a seam study and all these other studies like CLAC's work and that of NREL and others on related renewable integration studies to get to a heavily decarbonized future. And I want to talk briefly about aging infrastructure, and then I'll hand it over to Katie. But quickly, we can look at how transmission has enabled at least half of the wind capacity we have on our system today. If you look at what CalISO did to Tehachapi or what ERCOT did with the CREZ lines, what MISO's done with the MVPs, and even what SPP has done with the priority projects and balanced portfolio, those regional planning efforts by the ISOs and RTOs enabled a lot of the current wind development within the U.S. There have been other efforts within Colorado and Maine and Nevada and Pacific core system, as well as Bonneville, to enable transmission, but that enables renewable integration. It's really important. If you want renewables, you want decarbonization, you got to have transmission to do it efficiently and effectively. One of the things I want to talk about too is congestion, and this is an example of a study that was done, a pilot study by New Grid, that actually looked at using their New Grid router tool to do some pretty simple operations on the topology of the existing system. On the left, you'll see an actual case where SPP was actually curtailing wind back in 2018, and we had 3 binding constraints on the system. One was actually breached and overloaded. Able to show with this software is that with relatively simple breaker reconfigurations on the underlying 115 kV system primarily, with one operation per constraint, we could actually eliminate all the wind curtailments and actually get rid of all of the congestion on the SPP system, as you see where the color on the right is all levelized so that everybody's got the same LMP. On the left, you can see that the prices were up to $150, $200 a megawatt hour due to binding constraints. So there is technology that can help us deal with congestion, and I think that's going to be really important in the near term. As we add more and more renewables to the grid, we aren't going to be able to keep up with that need and demand by building a more robust transmission system. So there is a bridge to the future. Hopefully grid enhancing technologies will be part of that. So one of the challenges we have, I think, and is it's not just congestion on the physical system, it's also congestion in the interconnection queues. The queues have exploded lately. You can see the wind development and solar development in the South Plains of the U.S., in SPP and ERCOT, and over into New Mexico, as well as in the upper plains in MISO in the Midwest, and even up in the Northeast and offshore development. There's a lot of desire to build offshore wind, and to do that, we need to probably have offshore networks and not just radial gen ties. It's also a lot of development potential in the West. And so when we think about congestion, it's not just physical congestion on the grid, it's also congestion in the queues, and we got to fix that too. So real quickly, I want to talk about the interconnection seam study that was accomplished a couple of years ago. It finally did get released a month or so ago, but they actually looked at 4 designs. A base case, which is design 1, where we just keep the existing back-to-back ties between the east and the west grid in service, and then optimize the system going forward. One thing about all these scenarios, they got to about a 40% renewable penetration rate on an annual basis in these cases, significantly lower than the 80 to 90 to 100% cases that we're talking about now. Design 2A looked at actually just increasing the capacity of the existing back-to-back ties between the east and west grid with significant AC upgrades to accommodate that. Design 2B looked at the same thing with the DC ties expanding and the AC system, but also added 3 rather large DC links to the heart of the eastern grid and the heart of the western grid. And then design 3 has been referred to as the macro grid. This was the vision of Dale Osborne at MISO at the time. And it's a networked HVDC network that performs very well. And what I'd like to show you, I think on the next slide, hopefully this will work. Here's an animation of what we would expect to happen with the macro grid during the peak week of 2038. I'll run through this twice, but what you see in the yellow are the solar plants during the day. At nighttime, you can see that the wind plants in the plains are picking up and the exports are heading west. But during the day, the solar power is moving from southwest, desert southwest, into the heartland of the U.S. and then goes back and forth. There's a lot of information on these graphs, and you can use these animations. I want to go through it one more time if we can, just to let you look at it. On the right, you see a kaleidoscope. That's actually the transactions between the zones, the eastern grid on the right and the western grid on the left. On the bottom right, you see the actual flows, aggregate flows across the existing seam between the east and west grids, which is going basically up to about 30 gigawatts of exports from the west to the east during the day, and then turning around and going about 25 to 30 gigawatts of exports at night, with the wind heading west to serve the loads when the sun is not shining in the desert southwest. Very fascinating study. Hopefully that animation worked okay. But we need to take this to the next step. So what do we do with this? And that's what has led to these ESIG workshops and recommendations. I'll put a link in the chat to the ESIG website so you can follow up on that. But ESIG basically invited a bunch of experts from NGOs, from grid operators, from technology people, from policy folks and consultants and researchers to get together to kind of figure out what are we going to do to move this seam study forward. The goal was to create a high-level blueprint of what do we want this grid to look like and how will it perform and what kind of additional studies and analysis have to be done to get this to something that we can actually get behind as a country and support. So the final workshop is set for this Friday. I would expect the recommendations to come out in mid-January. So I wanted to just tease you a little bit to let you know that's coming, but I'll give you a link to ESIG. I'd encourage you to monitor that. One couple last slides. This is the 300 kV network that exists today. It shows primarily the 345, 500, and 765 kV system in the eastern interconnection, The ERCOT grid is grayed out there. It's mostly 345. Actually, it's all 345 on that map. Then the Western grid has some 500 kV and 345 kV. That's the system we have today. Highlighted in there in the gray is the SPP footprint, and that's where I worked for 20 years. One of the things I think we need to do is to figure out what to do with those old DC ties between the east and the west grids, and that's the reason we did the seam study. And we actually looked at also even looking at synchronous operations. But here's the point about aging infrastructure. So that's the grid today. This is the grid that we had, 45 years ago almost, and or older. Many of these lines were built in the 50s. So they're already 70 years old or approaching that. So in my opinion, a lot of these lines are great candidates for being rebuilt. And we need to consider taking advantage of those assets, those critical right-of-ways to rebuild and actually support the macro grid. With that, I'd like to conclude my prepared remarks. I look forward to the questions, and I hope I stimulated some thought on that. So let me stop sharing and let Katie talk.
Jay, thank you very much. Katie, over to you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Steve, and thank you, Jay and Tracy, for teeing up my talk. You've definitely laid out the great benefits mission in achieving both resiliency and climate goals. It's certainly important in achieving our future. And I think Tracy made an excellent point about thinking about what is it that we want to do. And if we have our objectives, which are many, how are we going to plan for it, and what are the trade-offs? So I mentioned these because these are the three areas where EPRI is doing work in helping policymakers and utilities and other stakeholders make their investment decisions. And so if we're going to build out this mega grid, have national cross transmission, and achieve these goals, how are we going to do that? So what EPRI brings to the table is through our public mission and the members that we have, we develop tools and capabilities to help put some rigor into the system modeling and operations, and also into planning. So let's begin with what is it that we want to do. So in terms of performance, there's a tool that we have. It's an integrated web-based software tool that provides current technology costs and performance data, information and trends for a wide range of electric power generation, storage, and distributed technologies. So this type of tool can help with looking at the current performance, and it's called TAGWeb, or Technical Assessment Guide Web. Let's think about power system planning. So if we have to look to the long term and the resources that our transmission is going to connect to, what do electric company planners, ISOs, RTOs, and others need to develop and evaluate the long-term electric system resource plans and the analyses that have to go with that? So there's another tool called Electric Generation Expansion Analysis System, known as EGIS. And what it does, it helps to determine optimum least cost generation expansion plans, or simulated detailed production costs for what we're planning to do. And again, there are many factors that go into the decision making. So there's a variety of generation technology options. So what EPRI tries to do is look at the various options that are available so that we can look at the different costs and benefits of each and how it interplays with the system as a whole. Tracy also mentioned having this holistic approach. So that's what we can do. And it also looks not just at generation technologies, but storage and non-dispatchable, solar, wind, cogeneration, and conservation load management. It also looks at demand side management options as well. So what can we do to look at the long-term power system? So with that, we want to go a little bit farther and look at economy-wide trade-offs. So the electric sector has done a fabulous job, although we still have a long way to go with decarbonization. But over the last decade or so, we've really led the way in reducing our carbon emissions. So what can we do to look at the different factors at play that go into the future with our technologies and policies and markets, and how will that play out? How will it play out not just for the power sector, but also other sectors, transportation, buildings. Can electrification help in those economy-wide models? So we have a tool that we've used for decades. It was known as PRISM at the time. It's short US region, and the long, because engineers, I'm an engineer, we have long names for everything. US Regional Economic Greenhouse Gas and Economy Model. So it uses different technology, policy, and market scenarios, both at the national and regional levels, to evaluate both uncertainty and risk associated with these future resource plans. We're using it now to look at potential federal 100% clean energy standards and the implications of those policy design choices and the electric sector outcomes. So stay tuned. It's coming out this month, a technical brief. But I'll say that one key finding we would say is that a federal clean energy standard does have a significant ability to alter the long-term effects of how the sector will, what the energy mix will be. And after accounting for accounting for the current policies and the rapidly declining renewable costs, it still will have an effect. And Jay mentioned in the SEAM study, I thought this was an interesting point, that I remember a while ago that we had like a vision of 80% renewables by 2030. This goes back a bit. And then the SEAM study now has lowered that a little bit to maybe 40%. Our model, and it'll be great for our modelers to get into discussion, look at wind and solar comprising over 50% at 2050 under the main, if it's 100% clean energy standard by 2050. So with that, when it comes to decision making, I also wanted to point out that the other design choices studied, those that affect the generation portfolio decisions, emissions, and cost the most, are the target date for reaching 100%, say 2035 or 2050, the emissions intensity threshold used to define and credit eligible clean generation, and whether negative emissions technologies are allowed. So can they receive credit commensurate with their carbon neutral emission characteristics? So with that, I'll close on investment decision making. It's complex. There are many factors, facets, and perspectives, and it will depend on the objectives that we're trying to achieve, the timing, the roles, operations, and resources. And we at EPRI and with GridWise and all of our stakeholders aim to support industry and government and other decision makers and provide them with the tools and capabilities needed to make the investment decisions to enhance and optimize resiliency and meet our climate goals.
Great.
So with that, I'll go back to you, Steve.
Thank you very much, Katie, and thanks again to all three of you. You've done a great job of kind of scoping the opportunities and the issues, the challenges that we're facing. We have time for just a few questions, so I'm going to kick it off, and I'm going to start with you, Jay, but Tracy and Katie, you're welcome to chime in if you have something to add. And Jay, maybe it's because you and I are old enough to remember that a national grid has been talked about for probably 20 years, maybe 30 or 40 years even, right? This is not a new concept at all. And in fact, what I remember is in the early to mid 90s, a lot of talk about superconductivity going to enable, from a technology standpoint, going to enable superhighways, super grid, if you will. That obviously hasn't materialized, not in the time that we thought it would, but other technologies are coming along to kind of give us some options. But the challenge remains sort of this mix of policy and technology, right? So the technology gives us part of the solution, but as you guys have talked about, the policies seem to both help and hinder, right? So what would you start off by saying, what do you see as the big challenge or challenges, the top one or two, let's say, right now to move us towards this, vision over the next decade or so?
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, there's plenty of challenges and opportunities for us engineers to figure out how to solve the problem. We need some direction. We need some leadership at the federal level. I think we're starting to see it at the state level as well as at cities and from corporate America regarding their commitments to decarbonization. But I don't think that the existing planning processes, at least at the regional level, are looking out far enough and actually reflecting what we actually expect to happen, you know, out 20, 30, 40 years. They're more short term and looking at what are the reliability problems within the next few years and addressing that. I do think that technology will be it's going to provide some opportunities, and whether it's, you know, burying HVDC lines or incorporating new superconductors into the design of a macro grid, we've got time to do that. I think what we got to do first is to get some consensus and support on what do we want this grid to look like. And it certainly is going to be much bigger than the grid we have today. We're talking about adding 10 times as many renewables to the system. You know, then there's only so many you can put on the roofs of buildings too. You can't do this all locally. You've got to have utility scale development, and I think that's where you get the real efficiencies and operational benefits too of capturing diversity. But you got to have the grid to do that. I think we need some revisions to FERC Order 1000. I think we need some new planning rules, maybe legislation to force us to think long term. And but certainly we need some leadership. But thanks for the question.
Yeah, let me follow it up, and then I'll let Tracy and Katie add too. But one of the questions from the audience is, you know, if we build these long lines, aren't resistive losses or just losses in general going to be too high to allow us to build these really long lines between regions?
Well, that's exactly why we're proposing HVDC links, where losses are virtually zero. This isn't like building an AC grid where losses increase with the square of the current.
Yes.
The losses on an HVDC network are very small. And the other thing, you get the benefits of an HVDC network is just the benefits of controlling and actually improving the resiliency and the responsiveness of the grid. We could deal with weather events and blackouts in California with no problem. You know, when we were turning the lights off in Southern California in August, there was 12,000 megawatts of wind in the plains that couldn't get there.
Yeah.
That was ready.
Good point.
It was actually being curtailed probably because of congestion. So we need to think differently and think long term. But thank you.
Tracy or Katie, would you like to add anything to that?
Sure.
Go ahead, Katie.
Okay, sure. I'd say the greatest challenge really gets into the people that have to live near the transmission. And so, you know, not in my backyard is a formidable force.
Mm-hmm.
And not to overstate it, it's just at my time at DOE, there were two really beneficial projects, but the states in between, you know, bringing Canadian hydro into New England was stopped by a state after $18 million in 7 years of effort trying to get the permit in. And then there was another project that was going from Oklahoma into Tennessee. And, you know, there were issues coming with that. And basically there was a state in between who said, not through my farm. And so how do we get through that? And so without just throwing a big negative out there for the big challenge, I think that when I was at DOE, one of the biggest successes that they found at the federal level is that the Department of Energy came up with an IIP, an integrated pre-planning process, where it really laid out the very, very complicated, long process, who you needed to talk to before you even decided to let the public know. Here's what you need to do, here's the messaging, and build relationships and partnerships in which you can get that buy-in at the state and local levels, because it's really where it's at. It's you know, people have to want to have this. Those of us in the industry think transmission towers are beautiful, but some other folks, not so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Tracy?
Yeah, I just want to add the all of that is right. I think that it will make a difference. The leadership again does make a difference, and part of that will be the governors willing to coordinate among themselves. We need to see governors joining together and taking a regional approach and doing more in the way of looking at a regional future. And I think with regard to NIMBYism, if there is an opportunity to make transmission part of a vision for infrastructure that includes broadband, there's going to be a lot more receptivity to that infrastructure, because that's a huge need. So again, stepping back and taking a more holistic approach, I think you can overcome some of that, but also it's just going to be doing the hard work of talking to people ahead of time. I think, so often, and this is true in my neighborhood as well as other places, if you feel like you've been left out of that conversation, you're more likely to be resistant to it.
And Tracy, I know one of the things the Macro Grid Initiative is trying to do is to encourage that dialogue between governors and other stakeholders, right? You're trying to convene an effort to educate people or get people on the same page.
Yes, yeah, we're working with a broad variety of stakeholders and encouraging those conversations and working directly with the governor's offices. I do think that the needs are very pressing, and that it will help with momentum as people are having to make these incredibly expensive investment decisions, and what's the no regrets strategy to make this happen.
Yeah, we've got to wrap up here pretty quick, but I've got one more question, and I'll let any of you answer, and that's, I kind of remember a number of years ago that Tom Friedman wrote a book, Hot, Flat, and Crowded, and at the end of his book, he said, if we could be China for one day, but only one day, right? And his sort of discussion or argument was around the tension between market forces, where we leave it to markets to determine what the right answer is, and sort of the public good, if we could just dictate, here's what it has to be, and everybody's going to do this, and we have a perfect solution, right? Or we have an optimal solution. How do you see that playing out, over the next few years? This tension between market forces and the need to, really make something happen. Anybody? Katie's smiling. Katie?
I was thinking, no, I was going to let someone else go first with that one, the market forces. I'd say it probably just goes back to collaboration and communication. Having the information that we need, we've really advanced the science in terms of interaction between the different components of the grid, and even with how end use patterns affect grid operations. And so if we're looking at, some of the order, like the FERC Order 222, how can we look at collaborating together to look at what the gaps are, and understanding how we can work together to address them? Because it's really not I hate to be cliche, but a one size fits all. Sure. It's so complicated, but you bring a lot of the experts together to kind of hash it out. It's almost like you wish you could lock them in a basement and say, figure it out. But it's a long process. Yeah. The communication and collaboration, that's right, I think would help.
Anything else, Tracy or Jay?
Well, go ahead, Tracy. Okay. I'll quickly. I mean, it's ironic in some ways, because without some of the transmission, if you could make an investment in transmission, you would make your markets more robust. So it's almost a chicken and egg question. But because of the congestion, because of the constraints, we actually aren't seeing these robust markets that have the advantage of these of the resources. And I'll just quickly say, when we were at a hearing, there was a member of Congress who somebody brought up China, and she just said, "Oh, that's China. Like you can't talk about China because it's completely different." But on the other hand, it raises the question, well, that I don't think that's really an answer to say you can't talk about it. That's China, because I think what you're raising is a good question, Steve. What can we do to have a little bit more of that intentionality?
Right. Jay, anything else?
Yeah,
Otherwise,
and I agree. And one of the things, I think we can learn from China. I mean, they are developing, 1,200 kV AC circuits and building 1,100 kV DC lines. They've surpassed us in terms of technology. And when you do that, you get a lot of capacity in existing corridors. Transmission is extremely lumpy. And I think we have to build big for the long term and not just do incremental upgrades to the current system to meet the next 5 years' needs. We need to identify where the corridors are, get support for that from the local folks as well as the national folks. Maybe we get some federal funding for this, and let's make it happen in a way that makes sense and fits into the current processes and tariffs.
Great. Well, thank you all very much. Time sort of flew by faster than we'd like, but unfortunately we have a session at the top of the hour with 2 congressmen. So I encourage you all to join us in that session at the top of the hour with Congressman McNerney and Congressman Lotto. We'll have some really good things to say. So again, Katie, Jay, Tracy, thank you very much. This is such an important issue, and we could keep talking forever about it. And I'm sure there'll be other events that each of you will be involved in where we'll have a chance to do that. So thank you all, and we'll join you at the main stage at the top of the hour.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.